So welcome. Hi, folks. As everyone is joining, I invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Many of you have been here before, but for those of you who are new, my name is Charmaine Campbell Patton, and I'm joined by my father, Michael Quinn Patton, who I'm sure many of you already know. And this is our final webinar of 2022. We've been doing a monthly webinar going through our new edition of utilization-focused evaluation. So we've come to the end of the year. We are doing 2 principles in one. There are 10 operating principles, and we're doing the 9th and the 10th today. And then we'll talk about what's next in 2023 at the end of this webinar. But before we dig in, I just want to do our local land and context acknowledgement that we do at the beginning of all of our webinars. We acknowledge that the sacred land upon which we live here in Minnesota is the homeland of the Dakota people, who have lived here for many thousands of years. And Anishinaabe people also reside here. And this land was unfairly ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. Both the state of Minnesota and the United States government carried out genocide, ethnic cleansing, and forced removal against the Dakota as a way to acquire land. They broke promises, and despite centuries of colonial theft, this is still Indigenous land. We recognize that, and that a land acknowledgement is only a small part of supporting Indigenous communities. And so we have committed to redistribute the proceeds from this year's launch of the UFE 5th edition to a couple of Indigenous organizations, one that's working on language revitalization here in Minnesota, and a global Indigenous environmental network. So we also want to just kind of zoom out and recognize that the December solstice will be happening next week. And that marks the sun's southernmost point in our sky here in Minnesota. That marks the longest night, shortest day, darkest day of the year. Anyone joining in the southern hemisphere will be having the opposite phenomenon happening. And then I would be remiss if I didn't recognize that we're in the midst of the World Cup as well. Later this afternoon, Morocco will play France for a spot in the finals against Argentina. Many other things happening in the context of the world, but just wanting to really hold that local to global connection, blue marble perspective that we try to bring. So just as a reminder, our overarching utilization-focused evaluation principle is to focus on intended use by and with intended users in every aspect and at every stage of an evaluation. We return to this every month because it is the core of utilization-focused evaluation. But there are 10 operating principles, as I mentioned, and we are going to be looking at those final 2 today: mobilize, follow through, and reflect and learn. So that is what we're planning to do today. Michael, do you want to say anything before we dig in?
No, just my welcome to everyone. Here in Minnesota, we're in the middle of a blizzard, and I've lost electricity twice this morning. So if one or both of us suddenly disappears, that's what's going on. And so we'll just let Alexi carry us on from there. Also in the north. But welcome to you all. I would simply add that one of the operating principle we're beginning with today, mobilizing follow-through, is one of the distinctive features of utilization-focused evaluation. And so as we talk about that, I think it's a fitting one to help think about how utilization-focused evaluation is located in the larger panorama of evaluation approaches. Go ahead, Charmaine.
Great. Yeah, so the principle of mobilizing follow-through is to follow through with intended users to interpret, act on, and fully utilize the evaluation findings. And the premises of this principle are that primary intended users should be actively involved in generating recommendations and that achieving intended use includes follow-through facilitation to support acting on conclusions and recommendations. So we're going to just walk through some tips and other kind of helpful ways to do this. So the first are some really looking at reporting and what does that mean with a utilization focused lens. So reporting really sets the stage for follow through and use. And it can include producing written reports, but also presentations, memos, blog posts, videos, lots of other things. And so when we think about tips for utilization focused reporting, there are 6. One is to customize. So really thinking about what different formats might be needed for different purposes and different intended users. So work with those intended users to determine what kinds of reporting formats and styles and venues are appropriate. Don't just go in assuming that a report is what's going to be desired, and strategize about some creative ways to do reporting that will be most useful. Within that, we've already, focused on this a lot, but staying user focused as always. So answer intended users' priority questions in the reporting and provide evidence. And report with users clearly in mind. Honor that personal factor that we talked about in a previous webinar, and really use what you learned about the people and the users in working through the evaluation to guide your reporting. The third is to use graphics and other visuals to communicate findings succinctly and powerfully. And really, data viz is no longer an option. It is essential. Many of you probably know Stephanie Evergreen. There are many others working in the field of data visualization who provide lots of useful and important insights into how to do this. And again, doing it with the users in mind. Think about the timing that the reports might be, delivered, or the findings and recommendations can be shared that is really going to be most useful. Deadlines and, your own timeline is not necessarily the same as when a report might be actually useful. So think about, we talked about this in previous webinars, but think about when are decisions being made and being able to produce reports well in advance of that to make sure that they can be read in advance and revised and really looked at and used during those key decision points. 5th is to really distinguish between dissemination and use. So thinking about, are the findings and recommendations meant for wider dissemination? Are they more internal initially? What is the difference between dissemination and use? And think about both formal and informal ways to disseminate findings. Think about new opportunities that might emerge for influence and use as you go forward, other places where the findings might be useful. And then finally, it's really valuable, I think, to make report revisions based on users' feedback. And this is different from changing the findings, right? And not trying to doctor the results, but really thinking about, I always like to provide, draft reporting, draft products to kind of get feedback on specifically utility and what's going to be most useful, as well as things that may have been missed or, other ideas to consider. So those are 6 tips for UFE reporting. Michael, what do you have to add?
The part of what's important about this overall principle is that reports are an output, not the outcome. Use is the outcome. So reporting is a means to that end. And what these tips are about is how to make those outputs meaningful to get to the outcome of use. The downside of most evaluations, the way that they are contracted, is that the report is the end of the evaluation, and that the deliverable is a report. An evaluation budget ends at the time that the report is submitted. But from a utilization focused point of view, because the reporting is simply an output and the outcome is actual use, that's what gives this principle its strength and focus, is that you have to plan for the time and resources and money and engagement to follow through to make the report actionable and meaningful. So reporting is an output, use is an outcome.
So when we think about recommendations, there are 10 guidelines here for generating useful recommendations. The first is to negotiate the inclusion of recommendations, kind of even to begin with. Whether or not to include recommendations doesn't, just like whether or not a report is going to be the product, that it doesn't have to be that way. Some evaluations might not include recommendations. And so this is really about connecting with the users and what's going to be most useful. Some believe that you should always recommendations, but others don't. Do you want to add anything to that, Michael, from a historical perspective? Or
well, it continues to be a matter of controversy, although virtually all evaluations require recommendations. And so as you see the other guidelines, we'll come back and talk about the importance of not just assuming that the recommendations will be the evaluator's recommendations. We've talked about our being evaluation facilitators. And so facilitating recommendations is different than the evaluators unilaterally generating recommendations.
mm-hmm. So if recommendations are included, really thinking about making sure that they flow from the purpose and intended use of the evaluation. So are they about program improvement, or about future funding, or about program expansion, about learning? So really focus on actions within the control of the intended users and those that they can influence. It can be really frustrating when recommendations are much more broad and not within the realm of something that is actually actionable by the users. The third is that the recommendations be data-based, so clearly flowing from the evaluation findings and engaging the users in the process of analysis, interpretation, and judgment, as we've talked about in the past, should lead to engaging them and generating recommendations based on that evidence. So really making sure that that connection is clear and held to. And then distinguishing different kinds of recommendations. So those that deal with central questions or issues can be kind of separated from those that are more secondary or minor, really distinguishing between those that involve major decisions versus those that might be more small improvements. And it can be helpful to talk about also time frame, what can be done in the short term, midterm, and long term. Thinking again about kind of optional formats, really thinking about, multiple options versus one course of action. Think about what's going to be most useful. Thinking about, if you think about a full slate of alternatives in recommendations, how can you facilitate a discussion with the users about the pros and cons for different recommendations, connecting them with the options of which findings will help to clarify assumptions, interpretations, and judgments?
We've lost you, Charmaine.
You can't hear me anymore? Can you hear me? Oh, you can hear me, Alexi.
Your audio's gone.
That might be you. It looks like I'm getting a thumbs up from Alexi. So I'm going to go ahead and keep talking.
Charmaine, your audio is gone.
Are you hearing me, others? Can I get some chat? I'm looking at the chat. Hold on. Okay, everyone but you can hear me, sounds like. So I'm just going to keep going. So illuminate things, folks.
It's on me then.
Yes, it's on you.
All right, I got to reboot.
All right, we'll stay here. We'll come on back when you're ready. Okay, so number 6 is illuminating the implications of the recommendations. So discuss the cost benefit challenges of implementing different recommendations, thinking about, again, these different levels and options, thinking, adding some context to those of what that's really going to mean. Being thoughtful and deliberate in wording the recommendations. So really, important recommendations can be lost in vague language. It really can be really helpful to be very clear, and particularly sensitive recommendations might be dismissed by overly assertive styles. So avoid words that confuse or distract from the central message. Again, engaging users in kind of how to word recommendations that's going to be well received, and thinking about the audience for that is going to be helpful. Allowing enough time to do a good job on recommendations. So again, this collaborative process of engaging with primary intended users and really thinking about, how you can work that into the process so that there is enough time to make sure that folks are really engaged in that. So, and also so that they're not coming as a surprise at the end, that there's been a lot of working up to them. Developing strategies for getting recommendations taken seriously. So helping decision makers think about how to implement recommendations, including potentially facilitating a working session around assignment of responsibility for follow through on the different recommendations and timeline and the timeline. And then again, follow through. So generating recommendations, even actionable ones, doesn't ensure action will occur. So planning follow through with intended users, again, as this key. And I'm going to look at the chat here because I see a few questions. Michael said in the early webinar, formulate if-then recommendations. Yeah, I think the if-then is really thinking about this idea of, as one of the formats, really thinking about different options. So rather than, only one set of recommendations, if there are kind of multiple pathways that evidence is showing you that could have, could be taken, thinking about, if this is the goal, if you want to reach, more of this population, then XYZ would be the recommendation. If instead the goal might be to reach as many people as possible, this might be the recommendation. So there might be different avenues for like, what is the decision and what is the goal? And then here's what the data show would be most useful. So that is going to come obviously in kind of how you're gathering the information, what the evaluation question was. But if there are multiple pathways that are revealed within that, providing some different, ways to implement that can help decision making, kind of give like the implications for different actions. I've seen some evaluation reports having strategic considerations instead of recommendations, and some having both. And I think, again, that is the language of recommendations, as we said, is not the only way to go. So that is really about working with the intended users to think about what is going to be most useful at this point in time for what they're looking to do. And, do the data even give enough evidence for specific recommendations, or is it going to be more of a strategy piece, or thinking about considerations to make versus recommendations? I think that language is really all about who your audience is and what the data show, that really, is there enough there to like give a specific recommendation, or is it more of things that need to be considered in decision making going forward? I see Michael's back. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. All right.
Let
We've
me,
just finished. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been back since let me share my screen for a moment.
Okay, hold on. Let me make you, all right, go ahead.
So you were asking about the history, and part of the history was that early on, Michael Scriven has taken the position that evaluations shouldn't have recommendations. And the phrase he used was, an evaluation without a recommendation is like a fish without a bicycle. This is actually a play upon a feminist slogan from the 1960s, that a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. And Scriven took that and turned it into an evaluation without a recommendation is like a fish without a bicycle. And Scriven's point was that evaluators know how to judge whether or not something is working. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have the skill to figure out how to fix it or what should be done in the future, and often don't have enough information or knowledge to actually make recommendations. So that he felt that we should stop at the point at which we're able to say what's working, what's not working, to render judgments, but not to do recommendations. So part of finessing that, as you've heard, is to talk about them as ways forward, issues for discussion, considerations going ahead, but not to make recommendations that become lightning rods. Interestingly, in the book, when the last edition was translated into Japanese, an evaluation without a recommendation is like a fish without a water, without a bicycle, was translated in the first edition of Japanese as an evaluation is like fast food sushi. An evaluation recommendation is like fast food sushi, because the translators could make sense of a fish on a bicycle as they deliver sushi on bicycles in Tokyo. And so they decided a recommendation is like fast food sushi being delivered on bicycles in Tokyo. Of the cross-cultural challenges of communicating both conclusions and recommendations. But that's part of the history. Back to your screen, Charmaine.
Is fast food sushi a good thing or a bad thing in that situation, or just a
Well, you want it to be
neutral?
fast if it's raw fish.
Fair, okay. All right, so so we ended with follow through as sort of the 10th part of the guidelines for recommendations. In the book, we talk about this as the end game in chess. The Queen's Gambit had come out right when we were writing, so referencing sort of how you complete the end game in chess. We've already said producing findings is not automatically going to generate use of those findings, and so really trying to think about, you know, how can you facilitate that use? Same with generating recommendations doesn't automatically lead to implementing those recommendations. Delivering the report isn't the end of the evaluation, and follow through to attain intended use by intended users is what we refer to as the end game. So now we have 10 follow through lists. There's a lot of lists this one. So the first is to plan for follow through. So develop a plan for using evaluation findings. Ideally at the beginning, you know, that this is worked into the initial contract, and helping users calculate the comparative benefits and uses of various follow-through options is planned for in advance. Again, that means it needs to be budgeted for. So encourage primary intended users to find adequate time and resources for follow-through and build follow-through into those budgets. Keep findings in front of those who can use them. So when folks receive a report, it can easily fall into this trap of thinking it's completed. So reframing the delivery of a report or the reporting process to include follow through to use the findings really means keeping the findings in front of those who can use them, and you know, making sure that that messaging is clear that that's not the end. Continue to watch for emergent opportunities to reinforce the relevance of those findings. So as you're going through the evaluation, thinking about this adaptive process, really, you know, identify when new challenges are emerging. For example, as we, you know, engaged in evaluation during the COVID-19 pandemic, everything had to be adapted to ensure the relevance of findings for responding to the pandemic. And evaluation can help make strategic choices about how to adapt findings through that follow-up engagement. And so that connects back to the principal aid of adaptation, and that continues to be relevant all the way through the end, this follow-through piece. Think about and be prepared to deal with any resistance. So this can be kind of passive resistance of ignoring the findings to more aggressive, active resistance of attacking the findings. And so wanting to really be prepared for that, not ignoring that, identify why that's happening potentially, and dealing with that, you know, different users, facilitating conversations about that, linking it back to the evidence. And hopefully you've been engaging folks who are going to be using the findings throughout the process so that things aren't coming as a surprise, but even still there can be resistance. So thinking about how you're going to deal with that, and that brings us back to the personal factor as well, and the relationships that you've built over the time of the evaluation. Watch for and guard against misuse, which can take many forms, including selectively, using certain positive findings, highlighting only those, or, really, trying to minimize something that is really important that, might have huge implications for the program and try to cover that up. Really thinking about working with intended users to appreciate the balance of reporting and the importance of framing things, to really think about how you're communicating even negative findings, like how can that be communicated and used without it harming or, being something that's seen as like detrimental. So really trying to pay attention to how, power dynamics and how the findings are being used. Do you want to talk at all about misuse or any of these before I keep going, Michael?
No, go ahead.
Okay. A few more here. Champion the use of findings, not the program. So advocate for use, that's a core responsibility, but that's different from advocating on top of advocating on behalf of the program. So making sure that you're kind of walking that line and that you're not then becoming a champion for the program itself. Continue to build evaluation capacity. So we've talked about this throughout, that every evaluation is a chance to build evaluation capacity, evaluative thinking, and that continues in follow through, thinking about how folks will use this and what questions it's bringing up that might turn into another evaluation or ongoing evaluation. And any reporting that's done, write it with follow through in mind. So as we've already talked about, adapting to different audiences, thinking about reports to external funders versus internal, lots of different ways to kind of write that will include follow through. And then consider the future implications of everything that's done. So short term is really focusing on immediate use of findings, but then longer term implications about how this is perceived, valued, and undertaken generally, and how the experience of evaluation was. This can generate, as I said, like a new stage of evaluation as they're thinking about what they didn't find out this time that they might want to look at next time. And just thinking about kind of how this is going to influence what's happening overall in the long term. So the big takeaway for this principle is use as a process, not a report. Anything to add for this principle 9, Michael? I'm seeing
There's some comments in the chat
Mhm.
that we could take on. One is about the should each finding have a recommendation, and my own view is that gets quite mechanistic and affects what people think of as the findings. Often it's the synthesis of findings that creates an overall sense of the results and what they mean. And a single finding or synthesis may lead to multiple recommendations, or there may be fewer recommendations than there are findings. So the one-to-one correspondence to me doesn't hold up. It becomes mechanistic rather than interpretive. The idea of making follow-through part of the simulation, I think, is a good idea to prepare people for what follow-through may look like to the extent that you can anticipate it. What is the best way to handle a situation where recommendations were negotiated, but the recommendation scenarios deal with resistance from funders and not the other parts who were involved during the process? One of the things that systems thinking brings into this is having the mapping out the intended users, going back to the overarching purpose and principle of utilization-focused evaluation, is actually mapping out what the different uses are for different stakeholders, how they relate together, what those relationships are, and even doing a kind of force field analysis about who is responsible or most accountable or most relevant to different kinds of recommendations. I've seen parts of a report that's been generated where there are recommendations for different groups, different stakeholders, different intended users. In the book I did with 2 Canadian authors called Getting to Maybe, How the World is is changed. We ended each chapter with a section on the implications for funders, implications for managers, implications for activists, implications for evaluators, and implications for the general public, or just people interested in the issue. And so that's another way to organize and think about the notion of intended use by intended users. Who are the subgroups who need to be involved in, and to fine tune recommendations with them, facilitating different recommendations for different folks, and then mapping out how they're each following through on their own responsibilities affects the whole. It's a systems map of following through on the recommendations. Seema has asked, if program staff have expectations in terms of recommendations and future direction, how should evaluators respond, given the early idea that evaluation should not have recommendations? Well, it's a great point. One of the ways of we've done this, Charmaine recently did a report which included a reporting on the recommendations of staff or other participants, so that recommendations are a form of data when they come from other people. And so to say, when we report, these are the ways that particular stakeholders have suggested the program be improved or things be taken into account, those recommendations become part of the data that you can report without either agreeing or disagreeing with them. That becomes part of the data. From Kathmandu, establishing a culture of use of follow-through matters a lot. Educating the decision makers in developing countries has become a challenge for the evaluators and emerging new entrants in such environments. Any recommendations, please? Well, you're quite right. It's a great way to end this principle, is that it is about creating a culture of use, and to get people thinking about not just going through the motions, but of actually having evaluation be useful. And I just was a part of a review earlier this week of a major international agency that has an evaluation terms of reference and reporting format, because they work worldwide, that is very rigid, that is very, it's very pro forma, prescribed, very dry, very non-inspiring, and not customized. It doesn't follow the principles of utilization-focused evaluation. It's much more accountability driven and much more treating evaluation as something to check off rather than something to use. So the culture of use is really fundamental to having evaluations be made meaningful. And that is building a relationship. Part of what I recommend in these kinds of situations where you're building that is to try to find low-hanging fruit, rapid turnaround issues that can demonstrate the use of evaluation. Things like early on, finding out what the dropout rate of a program and why people are dropping out, or what the recruitment problems are, what kind of reactions people are having to the beginning of a program, or the very partnerships that get created, is to look for ways to, instead of waiting for a year to have findings and results, or sometimes 3 years, look for short-term opportunities to demonstrate the use of evaluation. That's what developmental evaluation is a lot about. And I find that helps build a culture of use where people are finding it's pragmatic and useful in real time, not wait for 3 years to get a report for something to be used.
I think also thinking about what is going to, if you think about the decision makers in different places, like what is going to influence their interest in that. So whether it's some short-term wins, or is it looking at, evaluation standards and connecting that to use and showing that that's part of this. The Eval for Action network has, a lot of work doing capacity building around actionable evaluation. So thinking about what might that personal factor, like what might influence their interest in using the evaluation.
And Bob has added a point about identifying intended users on the basis of ability to make decisions that influence the directive of the program, is there a danger that relatively less powerful participants, such as program beneficiaries, may be overlooked or silenced? And that's a major point to be worried about right from the beginning. In the new edition of the book, we have a major chapter on the importance of equity in evaluation and taking the extra steps to ensure that those traditionally unheard voices of youth, women, smallholder farmers, people with disabilities, beneficiaries in programs, that we now have a professional and ethical obligation to be sure that they are included in all aspects of the evaluation. And that's gotten more emphasis in the new edition of the book than it has in the past.
Right. So it's not only identifying users based on their ability to make decisions and influence the program, but it's broader than that, as we talk about in one of the earlier principles on identifying intended users, that it goes beyond that. But that when we're talking about recommendations specifically, we are thinking about some of the different ways decisions are made and how we can include that in the recommendations.
By the way, one of the I was in a discussion again earlier this week, and the people working to decolonize evaluation, there are a lot of language issues in our evaluation, but one of the issues up for discussion is how to refer to program participants. And beneficiaries is one of the words that was turning out to be controversial because it suggests a power imbalance, that there are people who have things and those who don't have things, and it makes the beneficiaries appear powerless and not having resources or assets that they bring to the table. And so the language around beneficiaries is traditional, more colonial kind of language that is about donors, those with and those without, and finding ways to talk about participants in the development process, in the programming process, and view them as part of the intended use territory is one of the new directions that the work is going. That's part of reflecting and learning. Our next
There we go. Yes. So as we come to the end of our operating principles, principle 10 is to make time and space to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of the utilization-focused evaluation process and results so as to learn and improve. Premises being, as the world changes, evaluation must learn and adapt. Competencies and skills needed to continue to evolve as new technologies, issues, capacities, and approaches emerge, and the evaluation is dynamic, still developing profession and body of knowledge. So I'm gonna let Michael take this slide around single, double, and triple loop learning and what that can tell us about reflective practice and evaluation. Do you want to talk through this one?
Yeah, part of this is being able to really get more deeply into our learning and not make it surface. So single loop learning is about solving a particular problem. The example here is, how do I become a better evaluation facilitator? Double loop learning, as it's called, is understanding the source of a problem and changing the system. So it involves asking questions like, what shapes how I practice, what influences what I do, what worldview informs my work, in what ways, with what consequences. And triple loop learning is about learning itself, how to learn, how to question assumptions, how to think in new ways, creating a learning culture in an organization. How do I make ongoing learning central to my practice? How do I internalize being a reflective practitioner? How do I go ever deeper in my learning? I'm reminded of a quote that I've found useful in writing. Somebody asked me once how I knew that I was done with a book. And I said, well, I never actually finish a book. I just stop writing. you never actually finish learning. You just stop at a point in time. And the triple loop learning is engaging in thinking about how our constructs are changing over time, and decolonization is one of those new issues that has emerged that is about the global perspective on evaluation and learning about how what we introduce in the third part of the book is how to make sustainability and equity a part of all evaluations. That changes the evaluation practice in fundamental ways. How do we learn about those kinds of issues, which involves engaging with stakeholders in a different way than simply answering their predetermined questions, but bringing to the process the questions of who they are, who we are, and what the larger global issues are in the context of a climate emergency. So that involves this reflexivity framework that's in the book of thinking about what the perspective is of those who are program participants or participants in an initiative, those who are engaged in it, affected by it, part of it, the perspective of the primary intended users and other stakeholders. How do they make sense of things? What do they bring to it? And then how we think about ourselves. What do we know? What do we bring to the situation? What shapes our perspectives? With what voice do we share what we have to say? How does our background affect things? And this is a reflective framework for reminding ourselves that we're always dealing with at least three different perspectives in an evaluation. Those who are part of the initiative, those who are making decisions around an initiative, and those of us who are evaluating.
I think this kind of comes to this interplay between utilization-focused evaluation and culturally responsive evaluation, and just the recognition of values and the importance of being aware of your own, your own identities and history and privilege and power when you are entering into an evaluation space, dealing with issues of racism and white privilege, and really going deep into your own practice and what that looks like. And so, as Michael said, this move around decolonizing methodologies and culturally responsive evaluation is really core to this process. And so there are lots of people working in that. And these are just a few of the frameworks and writings on that, but we go into a lot of that in the book, and particularly in the third section of the book, where we deal more closely with equity and sustainability. Want to add anything to that?
Let me just add a couple of examples that have come up very immediately for me. Again, this week, working on this international program, they wanted and are doing innovation, and they've called what they're doing a pilot project. But what that's turned out to mean is that a pilot project has a specific kind of connotation, that it's something that has a logic model and SMART goals and ends up falling into formative and summative evaluation, where at the end you make a decision about whether the pilot worked. In fact, this is a systems change initiative. It's not a pilot project, and that calling it a pilot project has created an evaluation trajectory that is very traditional, limited, and rigid, and has ended up playing to the notion that at the end of the pilot, there will be a recommendation about whether to continue it, scale it, or stop it, when in fact there's no it. It is a systems initiative that involves multiple ongoing developments. It's not a project. And so that means that thinking carefully about how things are defined at the beginning, what kind of work there is, the categories for framing things makes a huge difference. A second learning, it came out of the experience at AEA was about principles. So that I've talked about when we're crafting principles that we're dealing with both values. Principles consist of the values that we care about and the knowledge base that we have. And we take knowledge and values and put those together to create a behavioral principle. And I was in a group with in a workshop doing a think tank around this when we were talking about agricultural extension, and the principle that emerged was to value evidence. The value that emerged was to value evidence, and the knowledge base was that you can use that knowledge that emerges out of agricultural research to enhance food production. But when one of the principles then that got formulated was to follow the science. And what became clear is that in this particular moment in the United States and in the pandemic, the term follow the science is completely mired in the public health debate about research and the pandemic and vaccines. And so another consideration then that I hadn't taken explicitly into account is when we're formulating principles or anything else in evaluation, we have to look at how is that terminology used in the larger world? What connotations are there about the term, so that follow the science would create a debate about agricultural extension that isn't really relevant to their particular issues. And that political context, when we talk about the principle of contextualization, learning about how to take into account the larger culture is one of the areas where we're now doing this work, like sustainability and equity.
So one of the kind of metaphors we use in the book is the UFE flywheel, which is this concept that is introduced by Bob Collins in Turning the Flywheel, which is a 2018 book about kind of how momentum can build over time. With each revolution of the flywheel, it gets faster and faster and momentum builds. And so thinking about how do we continue to build on utilization-focused evaluation with each new edition, and more broadly connect to other aspects, other types of evaluation, and really bringing that research and insights about organizational effectiveness to enhance evaluation use. And so as we think about the UFE flywheel, this process of engaging and identifying and engaging primary intended users based on the personal factor, determine the uses, co-creating the evaluation, and answering priority evaluation questions, engaging in the evaluation and providing findings that facilitate their use, and continuing to build on that process, and building momentum during that process to learn and adapt as you go. And so we talk about sort of 4 different points on the evaluation flywheel kind of clock, if you will, the face of the clock, where at noon you're identifying and engaging the primary intended users. There are reflective questions at each point of this for deepening professional practice, as well as personal awareness and competence. And so we have questions for reflection at each kind of phase of the evaluation flywheel that can continue to build on itself. And I'm not going to read through all of this, but we'll leave this up here, and then I'll put the next slide up and see if, Michael, you want to add anything to or call attention to any of these specific questions. And we'll send this out as well.
I just reiterate your basic introduction, and that is that the notion of the flywheel is that you, by creating momentum, you are helping create the culture of evaluation, to the earlier question. And that's the reason for suggesting some low-hanging fruit, some rapid turnaround, real-time evaluations early on, where you're going through the whole process fairly quickly so that you're building momentum, instead of just having one project, which is one turn of the wheel. If you have multiple reporting periods, multiple facilitation periods, where you go through the whole evaluation process, you're able to build momentum as well as for an organization over time.
So here are some from sort of the 6 and 9 p.m. slots around measurement, capacity building, your own knowledge about methods, and engaging with others. And then this idea kind of that we talked about in the last principle about, follow through and use, and what do you need to do as an evaluator to build your own abilities in that area. So again, I'll send these slides out, and this is also in the book. But we've got a little bit of time. Welcome questions, takeaways or reactions, and then we'll talk right at the end about what's next for next year, what we've learned this year a little bit. Anyone want to put a question in the chat or unmute and share any thoughts or questions with us? It's Elizabeth, I'm glad you appreciate it. Happy to be able to offer them. So as folks are thinking of questions, maybe what I'll do is I will talk about a little bit about what we're thinking for next year, and then we'll kind of circle back and see if there are any other questions. But basically, we want to continue to have monthly webinars, but we want to bring them a little bit more deeply into our Blue Marble evaluation community as well, and make a little bit more space for engagement and connection and learning. So we're going to actually move to Thursday, because there were a couple other webinars taking place on Wednesdays that we felt like we didn't want to compete with. So we're going to do the third Thursday of the month at 9 a.m. Central, kind of an hour earlier, which is 3 p.m. UTC. And what we're going to do is be sending out a request for folks who are interested in kind of more fishbowl style consulting, bringing problems or issues to a webinar format where we can engage with one another and kind of think about what issues are coming up, and then also be looking at these ideas of equity, sustainability, global systems change, and how do we bring those into the utilization-focused evaluation framework. So I will be reaching out to folks on our list about ideas for how to engage and connect and build sort of more of a learning community together, as well as just continuing to elevate some of the issues that we talk about in the third section of UFE, as well as the Blue Marble evaluation book. And Michael and I are also going to be working on the developmental evaluation book. It's been more than 10 years since that was first published. So lots of opportunity to continue to learn and grow together as this community has formed. All right, so that's what's next. I do see one question, Michael. Do you want to tackle that? Yes, you will be invited if you're on this list. And always follow Michael on YouTube. That's where the most content gets produced. So I'll put that plug in and the link as well. But then we'll return back to questions. Oh, we might have lost him. Okay, so I'm seeing any tips for working with partners to ensure there are enough resources for co-developing recommendations and follow-up when there may be limited resources in the original RFP didn't include this. Yeah, I mean, I think that some of what Michael said around sort of like early wins, early examples of follow through that can be done to show the value that could potentially be built upon to do a phase 2 that's like more focused on follow through is one option. Or, ways to build capacity for follow through so that it's not fully dependent on you as the evaluator continuing to be part of that. But one of the ways that I do it, especially working with small organizations, is to really like build use and follow through into my capacity building work as we're doing the evaluation, so that at some point I have to say, there aren't any more resources to keep me involved, but that you have the skills to be doing this, and kind of reiterating what those are and how to do that, and then remaining as sort of a resource for folks as questions arise, so that it's more of an informal partnership than it is informal. So that's one of the ways that I've done that. Let's see. comment. Yeah, terms of reference are really tricky. They don't often provide the opportunity to do all of this, and we don't do a lot of them anymore. Sometimes I respond to a terms of reference with more of a, here's what I propose that doesn't really meet your requirements, but that if you are interested in this, like, this is the way that we would approach it. And sometimes that, it gets good response and sometimes it doesn't. So it really does depend on the client and what they're looking for. So really, it is tricky. I think we're seeing more and more demand for utilization focused evaluation, developmental evaluation, but these principles will help folks really be, is that really what they're asking for? Or are they just saying that and that's not really what they want? They just want sort of a traditional summative evaluation. And so it does provide hopefully some frameworks for how to push back or how to provide or go further than what is asked for and push the envelope a little bit. We will be at CES. Sorry, I'm just still reading through the chat. That is our plan. Particularly hoping to have a bigger Blue Marble presence there as well. So hoping to see many of you there. And Diana, I know that the earlier time slot's a little tricky for Pacific. The reason for it is that we also do have folks on the other side of the world who would like to be able to attend. So that gives a little bit more opening for that. So hopefully 7 a.m. Pacific isn't totally undoable for you, but we'll continue to think about timeline and what that would look like and how to make it work for as many people as possible. Let's see. Evaluation reports without recommendations, suggestions takes away from the idea that evaluation helps improve programs. Evaluators' expertise as transdisciplinary scientists somehow diminishes the value of this profession. I think it's okay to be assertive in offering recommendations. Thoughts? I think it is lacking that balance of who's generating the recommendations and based on what. So we are certainly not saying there should never be recommendations, but that it's really about not seeing the evaluator as the expert. There is expertise, and particularly in facilitating, generating recommendations based on the expertise of the users and rooted in the data. I think that we find that is much more likely to be an engaging process that then gets used rather than this external person has said we should do this. The power dynamics are just really different. And so I think it's kind of looking at expertise differently and not saying that, like, now that we've done this evaluation, we know best and we're going to tell you what to do, but that now that we've done this evaluation together, like, what can we collectively uncover that could provide some insights on how to move forward? It's just a different way to approach that. So I think there's still space for recommendations, but just thinking differently about how they're generated and even potentially what they're called. I'm still scrolling. I think that was the last question. I'm glad that many of you found this space valuable. I hope to see you in the new year. As I said, I will be in touch. We're always open to feedback and really hoping to have more collective engagement and learning in the new year. So be well, everyone, and thank you. And sorry we lost Michael here at the end. As he said, we're having some weather, but we will be back in 2023. Wishing you all the best. Take care.